On this Monday night, online sextortion and harassment on trial. The hope for justice for teenager Amanda Todd.
This is Amanda's moment.
The disturbing allegations and the plea from the accused. The no confidence vote in British Parliament and how PM Boris Johnson survived. Defiant and defensive, the Chinese government's new warning to Canadian military pilots. Eye in the sky.
It's like game changer for the world.
How a Ukrainian boy helped repel Russian forces in a Global News exclusive. And out of office.
Most employees right now are experiencing burnout.
Ontario's new right to disconnect law redefines what off hours really means.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Chris Galis.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. A high-profile sextortion and harassment case is playing out in BC Supreme Court. A case linked to 15-year-old Amanda Todd, who took her own life 10 years ago after saying she was blackmailed by an online predator. In an unusual move, Dutch national Aydin Cobain was extradited to Canada to face 5 criminal charges. The trial is expected to last 7 weeks, and Neetu Garcha reports on some of the disturbing details revealed in court on opening day.
Carol Todd has been preparing for this day for 10 years.
It's a really good day, and it'll be a long 7 weeks.
She has spent the past decade without her daughter, driven to prevent what happened to Amanda from happening to anyone else.
To do this for the other kids and to provide awareness and education for parents.
Amanda Todd was just 15 when she died by suicide in 2012 after using flashcards to heartbreakingly describe the torment she faced. Her video became an international cry against cyberbullying. Now the long-awaited trial for the man accused of tormenting her has finally begun. Aydin Cobain is a Dutch national extradited to Canada in 2020. He faces 5 charges, including extortion, luring, criminal harassment of Amanda Todd, and possessing child pornography with the purpose of distributing it. Standing in the prisoner's box with his hands held behind his back, Cobain pleaded not guilty to all counts. In its opening statement, the Crown said Amanda was the victim of a persistent campaign of online sextortion after Cobain allegedly came into possession of a photo of her with her breasts exposed and her hand in her underwear. Cobain is alleged to have used that as leverage to make her perform pornographic shows on her webcam and using more than 20 phony usernames on 4 different platforms: Facebook, Skype, YouTube, and Gmail. He's alleged to have sent links of her videos to her friends, family members, teachers, and schoolmates.
We know how Crown is going to approach this case. They're going to try to show that the accounts were linked and there was a single person. We are going to attempt to present evidence to suggest otherwise.
Cobain's extradition to face charges in Canada makes this case unique as well as highly charged.
It's internationally, this is starting to happen a lot more, particularly when we're dealing with cases involving child sex abuse images.
Todd has made it her mission as a mother to continue sharing Amanda's story and to advance the conversation about cyberbullying and to fight for justice for her daughter, much of which rests in the hands of a 12-person jury.
Neetu Garcha reporting in New Westminster, BC. Thank you, Neetu. Tighter bail conditions have been imposed on Jacob Hogard a day after the Canadian rock musician was found guilty of raping an Ottawa woman in 2016. The Headley frontman will remain under house arrest in his Vancouver home as he awaits sentencing for the charge of sexual assault causing bodily harm. In the same trial, the 37-year-old was acquitted of 2 charges involving a 16-year-old fan. But Hogard is now facing another count of sexual assault causing bodily harm related to a separate incident in 2016. China is firing back, now threatening Canada over Ottawa's response to the tactics of Chinese fighter jets. That's after Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said the planes have been targeting our pilots in international airspace. Mercedes Stephenson has the latest.
Accusing Canadian pilots of provocation and warning of dire consequences. China is defiant in the face of criticism from Canadian and Australian leaders over its increasingly aggressive and dangerous tactics targeting Five Eyes planes in international airspace.
China's actions are irresponsible and provocative in this case, and we will continue to register strongly that they are putting people at risk.
The intercept resulted in a dangerous manoeuvre which did pose a safety threat to the P-8 aircraft and its crew.
In recent weeks, China has aggressively intercepted Canadian and Australian aircraft. Out of 60 intercepts of Canadian aircraft taking part in a UN mission, nearly half were considered dangerous. At times, the Chinese jets just 20 feet away. And on May 26th, a Chinese jet released metal chaff into an Australian Air Force plane's flight path, damaging the plane's engines. Today in Beijing, the Chinese government doubled down, defending its near misses with Canadian aircraft, saying its actions were reasonable, forceful, and professional, and telling Canada to strictly restrain its frontline forces and refrain from committing any risky and provocative acts, warning there could be serious consequences borne by the Canadian side.
It's blatant bullying. They're trying to intimidate both Australia and Canada into changing their stance.
National security sources say China's escalating tactics could be part of a push to claim more airspace, making it more difficult for allies to fly there. Chris?
Mercedes Stephenson in Ottawa. Thank you, Mercedes. In the UK, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has escaped unscathed once again after a secret ballot vote of confidence triggered by lawmakers in his own party. He'll remain the Conservative leader, but there is clearly a deep divide in his caucus. Europe Bureau Chief Crystal Gumansing reports.
The party continues for Boris Johnson. The British Prime Minister survived a vote of no confidence.
The vote in favour of having confidence in Boris Johnson as leader was 211 votes, and the vote against was 148 votes.
That's 32 votes shy of costing Johnson his job. Booed at weekend Jubilee festivities, Johnson, known here as the Teflon Prime Minister, had been feeling the heat for months.
I want to apologise.
Despite several attempts at apologies, his stick-proof scandal coding started wearing thin when it was revealed he attended several boozy parties at Downing Street and was fined for breaking his own lockdown rules. The vote was triggered after at least 54 Tory MPs appealed to the 1922 committee. It's a group of powerful Conservative backbenchers that have historically influenced the selection of party leaders. The issue with Johnson is his credibility and how his actions affect the reputation of the party and its chances of re-election. Johnson's predecessor also once survived a no-confidence vote. Theresa May, in fact, won 63% of the vote compared to Johnson's 59%. Still, May ultimately ended up resigning in 2019. No one foresees Johnson throwing in the towel, but he could be left dangling in a difficult position and looking over his shoulder at every critical decision facing the country.
What we're going to do now is take the opportunity to unite and deliver.
The question now, how will Johnson unite his party and win over voters with two big by-elections looming? Crystal Gumansing, Global News, London.
Moscow says Russian troops will push further into the contested Donbass region after the UK and US agreed to send long-range missiles to Ukraine. Ukrainian forces are still holding out in key eastern cities, and civilians are increasingly playing pivotal roles in some key battles. Jeff Semple reports from Kyiv with a Global News exclusive about the civilian drone pilots helping the Ukrainian military.
Last summer, Andriy Pokorasa saved up enough money to buy a drone. The 15-year-old practiced flying every day at his home near Kyiv. I'm afraid of heights, but I love flying, he says. I like taking pictures from up high. But in February, Pokorasa's town suddenly found itself on Russia's warpath. Russian tanks were spotted heading their way. Ukraine's military didn't know the exact location, so they began looking for a drone pilot.
Drones have been a tool of war for years, but Ukraine has witnessed a proliferation of these consumer-level drones, which can be owned and operated by almost anyone from almost anywhere, giving the Ukrainian military potentially thousands of eyes in the skies.
It's like game changer for for the war.
This drone shop owner says when Russia invaded, Ukraine's military didn't have any short-range drones. So he put out a call on Facebook for civilian drone owners to help locate Russian forces. The response was overwhelming.
If we didn't have such operators and drones who can help Ukrainian army, I think Kyiv already could be occupied by Russian forces.
More than 1,000 civilians answered the call to help, including the youngest volunteer, Pokorasa. The Russians were only a couple of kilometers away, but the military needed their exact coordinates. Pokorasa was the only experienced drone pilot in town. I was very scared, but if I didn't help them, the Russians could be here in a day, he says. The grade 9 student went with his father to a nearby field and put his drone up over the highway. Before long, he spotted an armored column of Russian vehicles. His father sent the images and coordinates to the military, and the Russian column was destroyed. Pokorasa's town was saved. Is she proud?
Yes, of course.
His mother says it was a sleepless night.
I
had no way of contacting them. I was so worried, she says. After that, she insisted they leave to Poland. With Russian forces now pushed out of this region, the family returned home last week. The military rewarded Pokorasa with this more advanced drone. And, he says proudly, he's also gained more followers on TikTok after posting some of his videos. I was so happy that I helped, he says, but also there were people in those Russian vehicles. They were occupiers, but still people. I don't know how to explain how I feel about it. The weight of the experience is a lot to carry, even for the bravest 15-year-old. Jeff Semple, Global News, near Kyiv.
What happens at work stays at work. Coming up, how Ontario's new right to disconnect law helps employees stay out of reach. Plus, the historic agreement between BC and a remote First Nation. The London, Ontario community came together to mark a deadly attack on a Muslim family which shook the city 1 year ago today.
On this day, we remember what happened. And on this day, we must remember why it happened, and above all, to whom it happened.
London Mayor Ed Holder joins the victims' family and friends at a ceremony to dedicate a community garden to the Afzal family, part of a series of events being held in their honor. Police say 4 members of the family were killed after they were deliberately hit by a truck last June, what prosecutors have described as a hate-motivated act of terrorism. The family's 9-year-old boy was hurt, but he survived. A 21-year-old man faces 4 counts of first-degree murder in the attack. And the federal government used today's somber anniversary to announce its search for a special representative to combat Islamophobia in Canada.
They will report, they will advise, they will issue recommendations, and they will work tirelessly to promote work to combat Islamophobia.
The new role was a key recommendation made by the National Summit on Islamophobia that took place last summer following the attack on the Afzal family. British Columbia and the Tahltan Nation have made a first-of-its-kind deal under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. It's a consent-based decision-making agreement which gives First Nations the right to determine what happens in their territory. And it creates a new model for sustainable mining and updated environmental practices and standards.
It's extremely important that moving forward, Tahltan rights, Tahltan decisions, Tahltan values are at the heart of all of these projects.
The agreement could allow for a massive gold and silver mining project to go ahead in northwestern BC. The right to disconnect. Ahead, the province guaranteeing your time off work stays off work. Have you found it difficult to shut off from work during the pandemic? Working from home might have its advantages, but it can make you feel constantly locked in, unable to escape the new workflow. As Ann Gaviola reports, Ontario just adopted a right to disconnect law to help employees unplug after hours.
The pandemic blurred the lines between work and home life like never before, especially for those who worked remotely. So the arrival of Ontario's right to disconnect law was most welcome.
There's been such a shifting of what we value, how we want to live, how we want to work.
But don't be fooled by the wording. The new rules don't actually guarantee workers a right to unplug from work beyond existing provincial laws, only that employers have to be clear about what disconnecting entails in the internet age. The numbers paint a clear picture of the problem. A 2021 Sun Life survey found 1 in 3 workers across Canada are suffering from burnout. And a recent poll suggests millennials more than older generations are feeling it most, and women reported higher burnout rates than men. France was the first country to implement right-to-disconnect legislation in 2016, with other European countries following suit. Ontario's rules are the first in Canada and apply to companies with 25 employees or more. But the approach on this side of the Atlantic leaves more in the hands of employers.
We tend to, more often than in European nations, put long hours working late into the night on a pedestal.
The Office of the Federal Labour Minister tells Global News Ottawa remains committed to developing a right-to-disconnect policy and that coming out of COVID, there's an opportunity to make workplaces permanently better. But there's no timeline, and even once implemented, any federal policy would only apply to the 5% of the workforce subject to Ottawa's employment laws.
Ontario was one of the first provinces to establish a requirement for workplace harassment and violence policies, and other provinces and jurisdictions in Canada soon followed.
Others will likely follow Ontario's lead, though questions remain about how rules can and will be enforced.
Disconnection for work is not going to be just a flash in the pan, flavor of the week discussion because of the mental health crisis that we find ourselves in coming out of the pandemic.
And after 2 long pandemic years, more of us than ever are looking for support to turn off. Ann Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Next, a Canadian hero's unsung sacrifice during the biggest operation of the Second World War. A sky-high salute over the National War Memorial today, honoring Canadian soldiers who landed on the beaches of Normandy at the beginning of the Second World War 78 years ago. The flyby was followed by a wreath-laying service at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. On D-Day in 1944, Canada suffered more than 1,000 casualties, including 359 Canadians who were killed. Operation Overlord was the largest military operation in history, and as Dan Spector reports, there's a growing push to remember those who made grave sacrifices for the greater good.
And these are my dad's dog tags.
On days like this, Harvey Engelberg thinks a lot about sacrifice and how without a series of selfless acts in the face of harrowing danger, he would have never been born.
How do I repay a debt to somebody who gave our family life? And then this picture here.
His father, Cobby Engelberg, was a young boxing champion when he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force, a fearless fighter at age 24.
That was my dad right there.
Engelberg was a radio operator during Operation Tonga on one of dozens of RAF planes to leave England before midnight the night before D-Day. The mission to drop paratroopers behind enemy lines in German-occupied France to soften enemy defenses ahead of the full-scale invasion.
Not only did they go over enemy territory before their own troops were there, they had the furthest mission from base.
His plane, a Dakota, was captained by 26-year-old flying officer Harvey Edgar Jones. Jones had given tours of Niagara Falls and studied business at the University of Toronto before the war. His niece, Helen Peterson, remembers him well.
The biggest thing I always got a kick out of was the fact he was so tall he had to duck through the doorways.
As their aircraft carrying 26 men on board rumbled over the French coast into the dark and dangerous unknown, German flak suddenly tore through the night sky. The Dakota was hit and immediately in flames. Pilot Jones ordered everyone to abandon the aircraft, and most did. But Jones refused his parachute. According to multiple accounts, he saw Cobain Engelberg injured and unconscious behind him and decided to attempt a landing.
I can only imagine, must have looked down and seen him lying there and make a decision. What do? Do I jump and say goodbye to my buddy, or do what I have to?
The Dakota plummeted into the darkness below, crashing on a farm in the small town of Bassonville, France. Harvey Edgar Jones died instantly, but Cobain Engelberg somehow survived, despite severe injuries, including a fractured skull.
From what I understand, he was under the wing that was still on fire when they pulled him out of there. A lot of luck involved here.
His luck did not stop there. The farm's owners brought Engelberg into their home, offering medication and treating his wounds. They would take in others, only later sharing details of their selflessness in a letter to Engelberg.
The two heroes in this story, the pilot and the farmers who saved him.
Alice Duhamel and her son Arthur looked after the farm and the injured men. They cared for Engelberg and others until an Allied unit reached them, transporting the wounded to hospital. Their heroism saved lives, and they would pay dearly for it. Duhamel wrote in a letter that she and her son were imprisoned by the Nazis for helping the Allies. My son was put to death by the SS, she wrote. After 6 weeks, we succeeded to escape.
You read that, attacking off all apart. That's crazy.
The Duhamels buried Harvey Edgar Jones on their farm, adorning his grave with flowers and a cross bearing the words, "Died for France, long live England." Years later, Cobain Engelberg named his son Harvey for the pilot who saved his life.
Listen, I got a name from somebody who saved my dad, so if he saved my dad, he saved me and my children and my grandchildren. So now we're 25 ancestors of Cobain Engelberg alone.
Engelberg says he'll be forever indebted to the heroes who made the ultimate sacrifice. Dan Spector, Global News, Montreal.
And tomorrow, Dan, will have part 2 of that special story about Harvey's long-standing effort to honor the Canadian war hero and what he's doing to thank the family who saved his father. And that is Global National for this Monday night. I'm Chris Galis. Tonight's Your Canada is Campbell River, BC, a beautiful shot. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you have a great evening.